Conventional archaeology propagates the notion that the further we look back into history, that the more archaic civilizations were and that the more inferior their methods of construction were. Yet all over the world are these megalithic marvels, as I call them, that whisper to us from a bygone age, that were engineered, I believe, with an ancient lost technology that confound today's experts, if they're honest, that defy our greatest modern engineering, and that tell us a different version of history. So in this video, we're going to talk a bit about ancient Atlantis and this golden age that almost every civilization around the world seems to have legends concerning. But before we dive into that real quick, just a reminder to subscribe from wherever you are watching on YouTube or Spotify. And if you can give me a 5-star rating on Spotify, that would be great. And also visit megalithicmarvels.com/tours to check out the lineup of incredible tours we have coming up. We still have a few spots left for our Secrets of Cambodia tour happening in early November. It's going to be incredible. And then we've got our Ancient Levant tour this March to Israel and Petra. And then coming in May of 2026, we have our Peru and Easter Island tours. And we have an Egypt tour on the docket for 2026. So bookmark megalithicmarvels.com/tours and lock in the early bird prices we got on all the tours that I mentioned. And I hope to see you on a tour. So again, every ancient civilization around the world seems to have legends concerning this golden age where the gods and mankind coexisted. And when you look into these legends, the oral traditions, and even ancient texts, as we'll get into, it talks about how these gods basically came to earth, took on some kind of form, and took wives and bred with earth women, and their progeny were this hybrid race. The Bible mentions this hybrid race in various spots, the most famous of which is probably Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. Let me read that for you real quick. It says, quote, "There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." Again, the Bible in many other places references these giants, these Nephilim, or this hybrid race. The Bible talks about Goliath, probably the most famous giant in the Bible, who at conservative estimates stood at least 9 feet tall. The Bible talks about his brother who had 6 fingers and 6 toes on each foot. The Bible talks about King Og of Bashan, whose bed measured, I believe it was 15 feet long. We also have the book of Numbers, chapter 13, I believe, which describes how the nation of Israel sends spies out to the land of Canaan, the land that they are to inhabit. And it says the spies bring back this negative report. Why was it negative? Well, when you read the whole story in context, the spies not only saw giant megalithic cities, but they literally saw giants. It calls them the sons of Anak, or the Anakim. So there's a reason why most of these spies were freaked out to go to battle against these giant tribes. But again, we have other ancient non-biblical texts that speak of a golden age and hybrid races. The book of Enoch, chapters 6 and 7 talks a lot about this. Enoch 6:1 reads this, quote, "And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children." And it's almost like some of these ancient texts hint to us that the Watchers' giant offspring was a surprise to them, because there's an ancient text called the Kebra Nagast, I believe, from Ethiopia, that talks about how when these giant offspring were born to the Watcher fathers, that they were so large the women could not give birth to them. And so the Watcher fathers would do this Caesarean type of sacrifice, and they would slay the mother and take out the child, infant, if you know what I'm saying, and they would save the demigod offspring at the cost of the mother's life. So it was almost like this ritualistic sacrifice. Again, maybe hinting that these watchers that took on flesh, bred with women, maybe didn't realize their offspring were going to become these giants. And then Enoch chapter 7, verse 3 says this, and they became pregnant and they bare great giants who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Okay, wow, there is a lot going on in that passage from Enoch 7, 3 through 5, I believe that was. So it says, these women became pregnant, they gave birth to these giants, and the giants began to consume everything on earth. Basically, they consumed all the acquisitions of men. So it sounds like it's saying they were consuming all of the food, all of the resources. And it says, when men could no longer sustain them, the giants, that the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. So it seems to me that it's saying they went to war against mankind. I believe this means they also became cannibalistic and were eating humans. And then it says they began to sin against birds in the animal kingdom. Now, many theorize that this means that they were genetically breeding with animals somehow and creating chimeras, creating monsters. We have another ancient text known as the Book of Giants, and this was found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it kind of seems to confirm what the Book of Enoch was just hinting at when it talks about giants sinning against the animal kingdom. For here's what one of these texts in the Book of Giants says. Quote, 200 donkeys, 200 asses, 200 rams, 200 goats, 200 beasts of the field were selected for miscegenation. They defiled, they begot giants and monsters, and behold, all earth was corrupt. So again, that's kind of the biblical narrative of the Golden Age. The Bible kind of mentions it in just sweeping passages. We've got the Book of Enoch, which is breaking it down in great detail. And then when we look at the Greek mythology and mythos, it seems to be romanticizing the Golden Age, you know, where the Bible gives it a negative spin, and Enoch does as well, where the Nephilim and the Watchers and the giants were basically taking over the earth and breeding out humanity. The Greek mythos is romanticizing the gods and even embellishing it, right? Where we've got the Titans and they had superhero-like powers. Again, we also have these legends from almost every ancient civilization talking about the gods mingling with mankind and hybrids and giants. I've been to Peru multiple times. Every time I go, I learn more about their culture. Even the legends of the Inca, they talk about the giants, and the giants even building a lot of the superstructures. That's not me saying this. That's not just the Bible saying this. This is the legends from the ancient Andean region. Now, before we get into the Atlantis specific part of all this, I should point out that we have several ancient historians, such as Josephus. He lived in the 1st century. He was a 1st century Roman and Jewish historian. He wrote about the Roman and Jewish wars. His most popular writing is called The Antiquities of the Jews. And across his many writings, he references giants. And here's one of his famous quotes. Quote, "There were till then left the race of giants, who had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different from other men, that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are still shown to this very day, unlike to any credible relations of other men." So in this Golden Age epoch of old, I believe there was ancient lost civilizations that built ancient megalithic cities with polygonal mortarless walls, and one of these was Atlantis. Now, one of the most famous accounts we have regarding the myth of Atlantis comes from Plato, and this comes from Plato's work called Critias, which is considered one of his dialogues. It was written as a sequel to his other dialogue called Timaeus. And Critias is famous because it contains Plato's fullest account, again, of the myth of Atlantis. But it also talks about politics, cosmology, the comparison between ideal societies and their corruption. But unfortunately, the text is complete. It basically breaks off mid-sentence, so we only have part of what Plato intended. And I'm going to read the most fascinating parts of Critias for you in just a few moments. But first, I want to kind of give you a structured breakdown of it. So first of all, we've got the setting and connection to this other earlier dialogue, Timaeus. So this dialogue is set in Critias the day after Timaeus. And in it, Socrates has just given his vision of the ideal state in the Republic. And now he wants to see his vision put into action in a story. So you've got Critias, Hermocrates, and Timaeus present in this dialogue. And Critias takes the main role in the dialogue. Now, regarding the source of this story, so Critias says the tale came from his grandfather, who heard it from a guy named Solon, who was an Athenian lawgiver. And Solon supposedly heard it from this ancient Egyptian priest who preserved it from his ancient records. And what's so interesting is that the Egyptian priest states that Athens was actually much older than the Greeks even believed, and that Athens once had a great city and constitution long before the known historical period. And they told of repeated catastrophes, fires, floods that wiped out ancient civilizations, erasing their memory, except for Egypt, which preserved this knowledge. And so basically there was this primeval Athens that was described as an ideal state aligned with principles of justice and order outlined in the Republic. And these Athenians were brave, supposedly, and just and moderate, and they resisted corruption, and they lived in harmony with their land, and they were guided by virtue and wisdom and all this stuff. They stood as defenders of freedom for all who were threatened by tyranny. And so opposing ancient Athens, you had ancient Atlantis, this great island beyond the Pillars of Hercules. At first, the Atlanteans come off as virtuous, just, but as generations passed, it's like they became greedy, imperialistic, corrupt, and violent. And they built this enormous empire, conquering all these lands, and eventually attempted to subjugate the entire Mediterranean. And so then there's this epic battle where Athens alone stands up to this Atlantean empire. And there's these great wars that followed, and the ancient Athenians defeat Atlantis, proving their virtue and their courage. After this, at some point, violent cataclysms strike, earthquakes, floods, and Atlantis gets basically destroyed in a single day and night, sinking beneath the sea. And Athens too suffers calamities, loses most of its records, and this is why the Greeks no longer remembered these prehistoric events. And so again, just before I begin to read some of Critias for you, just a reminder, Plato's work here of Critias, it's recounting this conversation between Solon of Athens and this old Egyptian priest. And the priest is explaining to Solon that advanced civilizations once ruled the earth before they were wiped out by this great flood and cataclysms. And as we are going to read, the gods basically distribute the whole earth into portions. They're making themselves temples. They're instituting sacrifices. Poseidon was given the island of Atlantis, where he had 10 sons by a mortal woman. So again, like the book of Genesis and Enoch is saying, the gods breeding with earth women. And we do have other sources that hint that these 10 sons of Poseidon were giants. So I will now read for you the top highlights from Plato's Critias dialogue. I've read previously through the entire text and taken out the best can't miss parts, which I believe shed so much incredible light on the prehistoric world that the mainstream history narrative simply doesn't want to talk about. So here we go, starting with Critias speaking here. He says, quote, "Let me begin by observing, first of all, that 9,000 was the sum of years which had elapsed since the war which was said to have taken place between those who dwelt outside the pillars of Hercules and all who dwelt within them. This war I am going to describe. Of the combatants on one side, the city of Athens was reported to have been the leader and to have fought out the war. The combatants on the other side were commanded by the kings of Atlantis, which, as was saying, was an island greater in extent than Libya and Asia, and when afterwards sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean. But I must describe first of all Athenians of that day, and their enemies who fought with them, and then the respective powers and governments of the two kingdoms. Let us give the precedence to Athens. In the days of old, the gods had the whole earth distributed among them by allotment. There was no quarreling. All of them, by just apportionment, obtained what they wanted, and peopled their own districts. And when they had peopled them, they tended us, their nurslings and possessions, as shepherds tend their flocks, excepting only that they did not use blows or bodily force, as shepherds do, but governed us like pilots from the stern of the vessel, which is an easy way of guiding animals, holding our souls by the rudder of persuasion according to their own pleasure. Thus did they guide all mortal creatures. Now different gods had their allotments in different places, which they set in order. Now the country was inhabited in those days by various classes of citizens. There were artisans, there were husbandmen, there were also a warrior class originally set apart by divine men. The latter dwelt by themselves and had all their things suitable for nurture and education. Neither had any of them anything of their own, but they regarded all that they had as common property. The land was the best in the world, and was therefore able in those days to support a vast army raised from the surrounding people. Again, a reminder that I'm just reading you different portions and sections. So that portion ended, and now Critias is talking about the great cataclysms, and he says this, quote, "Many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years. For that is the number of years which have elapsed since the time of which I am speaking." Critias continues, quote, "I have before remarked in speaking of the allotment of the gods that they distributed the whole earth into portions differing in extent, and made for themselves temples and instituted sacrifices. And Poseidon, receiving for his lot the island of Atlantis, begat children by a mortal woman, and settled them in a part of the island, which I will describe. Looking towards the sea, but in the center of the whole island, there was a plain which is said to have been the fairest of all plains and very fertile. Near the plain, and also in the center of the island at a distance of about 50 stadia, there was a mountain not very high on any side. In this mountain there dwelt one of the earth-born primeval men of that country, whose name was Evenor, and he had a wife named Leucip, and they had an only daughter who was called Plato. The maiden had already reached womanhood when her father and mother died. Poseidon fell in love with her and had intercourse with her, and breaking the ground, enclosed the hill in which she dwelt all around, making alternate zones of sea and land larger and smaller, encircling one another. He himself, being a god, found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the center island, bringing up two springs of water from beneath the earth, one of warm water and the other of cold, and making every variety of food to spring up abundantly from the soil. He also begat and brought up 5 pairs of twin male children, and dividing the island of Atlantis into 10 portions, he gave to the firstborn of the eldest pair his mother's dwelling and the surrounding allotment, which was the largest and the best, and made him king over the rest. The others he made princes and gave them rule over many men and a large territory. He named them all. The eldest, who was the first king, he named Atlas, and after him the whole island and the ocean were called Atlantic. To his twin brother, who was born after him, he obtained as his lot the extremity of the islands toward the pillars of Hercules. All right, and what we are about to read next is Critias describing how these gods were building out the rest of the island. It says, quote, "First of all, they bridged over the zones of sea which surrounded the ancient metropolis, making a road to and from the royal palace. And at the very beginning, they built the palace in the habitation of the god and of their ancestors, which they continued to ornament in successive generations, every king surpassing the one who went before him to the utmost of his power, until they made the building a marvel to behold for size and beauty." Okay, let's pause here and let me just say that it sounds like they're talking about an epic, colossal, megalithic city that they've built. I can kind of picture this as being what we might see at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, with 200-ton megalithic blocks, mortarless, to where you can't fit a hair through the stones, and just built out in almost a perfect precision sense. It continues, quote, "And beginning from the sea, they bored a canal of 300 feet in width and 100 feet in depth and 50 stadia in length, which they carried through to the outermost zone, making a passage from the sea up to this, which became a harbor, and leaving an opening sufficient to enable the largest vessels to find ingress." So they are basically having no problem at all manipulating the island, boring out canals, making megalithic cities, and really earth-shaping the entire island, kind of like what we see in Peru when you go into the Cusco highlands and you can see that the ancient megalithic engineers of Peru, which some call the Hanan Pacha, had no problem at all literally shaping the mountains themselves. Like when you go to Ollantaytambo, the biggest ancient archaeological site in Peru, you'll see the Temple of the Condor. And it's literally a mountainous outcropping that they carved to be a gigantic condor, under which you see under its wings are megalithic cutouts and then megalithic blocks and fountains everywhere. And then across the street from this site at Ollantaytambo, you see the gigantic face of Tanupa or Viracocha carved into the mountain. It's colossal. It's like 10 stories high, and it's a giant face. The point is, these ancients, wherever they were in this Atlantean world, had the technology and the means and the knowledge to easily shape the earth, and I believe ancient technology to construct megalithic cities. Okay, it continues talking about this incredible Atlantean city. Quote, "The island in which the palace was situated had a diameter of 5 stadia, all this including the zones and the bridge, which was the 6th part of a stadium in width. They surrounded by a stone wall on every side, placing towers and gates on the bridges where the sea passed in. The stone which was used in the work they quarried from underneath the center of the island, and from underneath the zones on the outer as well as the inner side. One kind was white, another black, and a third red. And as they quarried, they at the same time hollowed out double docks having roofs formed out of the native rock." Now, let me hit the pause button here. There's so much to unpack. Okay, it says having roofs formed out of the native rock. They're telling us that these superstructures they are building do not have wooden roofs and ceilings. It's all precision rock. And that somehow they were quarrying this rock from underneath the center of the island. I might have to do a deeper dive on this later. It says they were quarrying from underneath the center island and from underneath the zones, on the outer as well as the inner side. It continues, quote, some of their buildings were simple, but in others they put together different stones, varying the color to please the eye and to be a natural source of delight. The entire circuit of the wall, which went round the outermost zone, they covered with a coating of brass, and the circuit of the next wall they coated with tin, and the third, which encompassed the citadel, flashed with a red light of orichalcum, I believe it's pronounced. So this colossal city and structures they're building were not just stone temples. They're telling us they were beautiful, pleasing to the eye. They were artistic. It was a masterpiece. The walls and the stone were literally covered with these materials, brass and tin, and they were full of color, and they flashed and radiated light. So now Critias continues talking about the temple area. It says, quote, the palaces in the interior of the citadel were constructed on this wise. In the center was a holy temple dedicated to Plato and Poseidon, which remained inaccessible and was surrounded by an enclosure of gold. This was the spot where the family of the 10 princes first saw the light, and thither the people annually brought the fruits of the earth in their season from all the 10 portions, to be an offering to each of the 10. Here was Poseidon's own temple, which was a stadium in length, and a half a stadium in width, and of a proportionate height, having a strange, barbaric appearance. That's very interesting, a strange, barbaric appearance. It continues, all the outside of the temple, with the exception of the pinnacles, they covered with silver, and the pinnacles with gold. In the interior of the temple, the roof was of ivory, curiously wrought everywhere with gold and silver and orichalcum. And all the other parts, the walls and pillars and floor, they coated with orichalcum. In the temple, they placed statues of gold. There was the god himself standing in a chariot, the charioteer of 6 winged horses, and of such a size that he touched the roof of the building with his head. Around him there were 100 Nereids riding on dolphins. And those are like mythical sea nymphs that were daughters of the sea god Nereus. There were also in the interior of the temple other images which had been dedicated by private persons. And around the temple on the outside were placed statues of gold of all the descendants of the 10 kings and their wives. And there were many other great offerings of kings and of private persons coming both from the city itself and from the foreign cities over which they held sway. There was an altar too, which in size and workmanship corresponded to this magnificence, and the palaces in the like manner answered to the greatness of the kingdom and the glory of the temple. In the next place, they had fountains, one of cold and another of hot water, in gracious plenty flowing, and they were wonderfully adapted for use by the reason of the pleasantness and excellence of their waters. They constructed buildings about them and planted suitable trees. Also they made cisterns, some open to the heavens, others roofed over, to be used in winter as warm baths. There were the king's baths and the baths of private persons, which were kept apart, and there were separate baths for women and for horses and cattle, and to each of them they gave as much adornment as was suitable. Of the water which ran off, they carried some to the grove of Poseidon, where were growing all manner of trees of a wonderful height and beauty, owing to the excellence of the soil, while the remainder was conveyed by aqueducts along the bridges to the outer circles. And there were many temples built and dedicated to many gods, also gardens and places of exercise, some for men and others for horses, in both of the 2 islands formed by the zones. And in the center of the larger of the 2, there was set apart a race course of a stadium in width and in length, allowed to extend all around the island for horses to race in. As to the offices and honors, the following was the arrangement from the first. Each of the 10 kings in his own division and in his own city had the absolute control of the citizens, and in most cases of the laws, punishing and slaying whomever he would. Okay, I'll hit the pause button. So that right there to me sounds like these kings ruled with an iron fist when it says that they basically controlled all the laws and punished and slayed whomever he would. What I'm about to read next is Critias describing this interesting sacrificial system they had set up with bulls, where they would hunt the bulls in this very strange way and then bring them to the temple. Check this out. It reads, quote, "There were bulls who had the range of the temple of Poseidon, and the 10 kings being left alone in the temple, after they had offered prayers to the god that they might capture the victim, which was acceptable to him, hunted the bulls without weapons, but with staves and nooses. And the bull which they caught, they led up to the pillar and cut its throat over the top of it, so that the blood fell upon the sacred inscription. Now on the pillar, beside the laws, there was inscribed an oath invoking mighty curses on the disobedient. When therefore, after slaying the bull in the accustomed manner, they had burnt its limbs, they filled a bowl of wine and cast it in a clot of blood for each of them. The rest of the victim they put in the fire, after having purified the column all around. Then they drew from the bowl in golden cups, and pouring a libation on the fire, they swore that they would judge according to the laws on the pillar, and would punish him who in any point had already transgressed them, and that for the future they would not, if they could help, offend against the writing on the pillar, and would neither command others nor obey any ruler who commanded them to act otherwise than according to the laws of their father Poseidon. This was the prayer which each of them offered up for himself and for his descendants at the same time, drinking and dedicating the cup out of which he drank in the temple of the god. And after they had supped and satisfied their needs, when darkness came on and the fire about the sacrifice was cool, all of them put on the most beautiful azure robes, and sitting on the ground at night over the embers of the sacrifices by which they had sworn, and extinguishing all the fire about the temple, they received and gave judgment. If any of them had an accusation to bring against anyone, and when they had given judgment, at daybreak they wrote down their sentences on a golden tablet, and dedicated it together with their robes to be immemorial. And I will conclude the reading of this portion with these last couple paragraphs. It continues, quote, "There were many special laws affecting the several kings inscribed about the temples, but the most important was the following. They were not to take up arms against one another, and they were all to come to the rescue if anyone in any of their cities attempted to overthrow the royal house. Like their ancestors, they were to deliberate in common about war and other matters, giving the supremacy to the descendants of Atlas. And the king was not to have the power of life and death over any of his kinsmen unless he had the assent of the majority of the 10. Such was the vast power which the god settled in the lost island of Atlantis." And then the very last paragraph we have written here in the Critias text states this, quote, "Zeus, the god of gods, who rules according to the law and is able to see into such things, perceiving that an honorable race was in a woeful plight and wanting to inflict punishment on them that they might be chastened and improve, collected all the gods into their most holy habitation, which, being placed in the center of the world, beholds all created things. And when he had called them together, he spake as follows." And then very sadly, that's where the Critias text dialogue cuts off, which has been lost. So unfortunately, we have this incomplete ending. After describing Atlantis's geography and resources, canals, the temples, the palaces in detail, the dialogue basically breaks off mid-sentence. And it was clearly meant to continue with the actual war between Athens and Atlantis, but Plato never finished it, or the text was lost. Something happened. But some of the bigger takeaways from that text are, ideal versus corrupt societies, and Athens kind of represents order, justice, and philosophy, and Atlantis represents decadence and imperial ambition. Another big takeaway is just the cycles of history, how civilizations rise and they collapse through these natural catastrophes. And so I don't know about you, but to me, that tale of Atlantis is simply fascinating because it's a glimpse into the golden age. It's a glimpse into the prehistoric world where I believe these lost civilizations were ruling. I find it so fascinating how Plato, through Critias, is describing the architecture of this golden age and the demigods, the hybrid races, and what looks like, humans versus the hybrids. It's almost like ancient Athens over here is the humans, and over here is the ancient Atlanteans, the hybrids building their megalithic paradise. Until these gods, these hybrids, want to take over what the humans have going and war ensues, right? Which sounds very similar to what we see in Genesis, what we see in Enoch, where mankind is going to war against the hybrids to exterminate them before the hybrids can breed them out. It's also important to point out that a lot of the ancients believe the megaliths we see today were built by the sons of the gods. I mentioned earlier that there's so many legends in Peru of giants building the biggest walls, and you have these legends all over. But the point is, we have this word called cyclopean, and that is, interestingly, the word used often, especially in Europe, in Greece, and in Italy, when you see those incredible megaliths. The word cyclopean describes the style of the wall. Well, obviously, the word cyclopean comes from the word cyclops, where in Greek mythology, the Cyclops were the giant one-eyed sons of the gods, who were considered master masons and experts in metallurgy, who constructed megaliths all over Italy and Greece. So was Cyclops a literal one-eyed hybrid giant of the prehistoric past, or was he more symbolic of the lost knowledge the megalithic engineers possessed in ages past? So in closing, the big takeaway for this video is that almost every ancient civilization has legends, has oral traditions concerning a golden age, concerning a worldwide flood and a cataclysm. And many researchers believe that evidence is piling up for a global cataclysm that hit Earth around 12,500 years ago. And they often refer to this as the Younger Dryas event, which begins about 12,500 years ago. So for fun, let's take this date of 12,500 years ago and set it right here. And then let's think about the ancient site of Göbekli Tepe, where even mainstream archaeologists are now saying that the oldest blocks and T-pillars there date about 11,500 years ago. Okay, so we got 12,500 years ago, lots of evidence for a global cataclysm, the Younger Dryas event, which lasted about 1,000 years. And then we've got 11,500 years ago for the dating of the building of Göbekli Tepe, okay? Well, what's interesting is this is also the approximate date, 11,500 years ago, that Plato's giving us for the submergence of Atlantis, because he said that Atlantis was submerged 9,000 years before Solon visited Egypt. And that visit took place around 500 BC, if you believe what Plato's saying. So essentially, Plato is telling us Atlantis was submerged about 9,500 BC, which would equal 11,500 years ago. So to me, it is so interesting to consider all of these dates and consider what might have been. But the one thing I know for sure is that there is so much more to history than we have led to believe, and that the old world was a fascinating world. Mainstream, again, wants us to believe that the further we look back into history, there's really nothing to see there. The more archaic it was, the more inferior their methods of construction. But I believe the megaliths we see today, I believe the legends that we read about today from guys like Plato hint to us of a different history. That the further we look back, the more advanced they really were. The further we look back, the more incredible their means of engineering. And I hope you enjoyed this episode on the tales and secrets in the fascinating history and legends concerning Atlantis.